This is Katherine Lambrecht. I do the programs for the Highland Park Historical Society. The program tonight is is from a grant from Illinois Humanities. This is the Rhodes Scholar Speakers Bureau, which I actually happen to be one of them. I do a talk on
do that.
There's the postcard. State fair recipes. And in fact, there's my picture and your picture. We both look rather lovely, don't we?
We do.
And since I usually run away from the camera, I'm so glad on this occasion it looks okay. I'm Nancy Webster, wherever you are in the land of the internet ether. I'm going to turn it over to you.
So hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're excited about this postcard program, not only because Highland Park was fortunate. We had several early photographers, including professional photographer Orson Brand, and many postcards by multiple publishers have been printed with his photography. And also, in case you're not aware, several postcard collections of Highland Park have been digitized and are available online on the Digital Library of America, on our catalog. And if you have any questions, please call the Society or the Highland Park Public Library for questions to help find things. I was sharing about the various postcard collections that we have in the Highland Park Archives and Local History Collection, in particular by local photographer Orson Brand, and his pictures were distributed to several publishers, including Tech. Many of our collections, including postcard collections, are digitized, and you can find them online on the Digital Library of America, on our catalog website. And if you need assistance, which you will because they're scattered and there's lots of deep links, just call the Historical Society or the library, the Highland Park Public Library, or email us, and we'll help you find whatever documents or postcards you'd like to see or find online. And of course, the Society always welcomes donations of any amount are welcome. You can do that at our website, highlandparkhistory.com, and via PayPal through our website. And I want to get straight to this really great postcard presentation that Katherine has for us. And I always thought of Katherine as someone really far north before I started working on the North Shore myself. And Katherine is the founding curator of the Curate Postcard Archives at the Lake, and it was at the Lake Forest County Preserve District. So it's thanks to her we have these wonderful collections now at the Newberry, many online. And Katherine was responsible for creating and developing this whole program of making these postcards available. And we're just going to ask for her to start and tell us more now. Thank you, Katherine.
Well, thank you. And it's just a pleasure to be with you. I am, as Katherine described it, Katherine Lambrecht described it, with you this evening through the auspices of the Illinois Humanities Rhodes Scholar Program. In normal times, non-COVID times, scholars and historians and presenters go around the state through this program for delivering whatever their special area of knowledge is all over the state of Illinois. I started as a Rhodes Scholar in 2019. That was my first year. And it really was a lot of fun because I went to many rural locations, towns, every one of them charming in their own way, but not places I would have had occasion to visit if not having been invited to speak at a library or historical society or museum through this program. It's one of the, I think I'm correct in saying it's one of the most successful programs that the Illinois Humanities Council has put together. It's been in place for some years now, and it allows even the tiniest little rural town with a public library or a historical society or genealogical society to bring speakers in free of charge to the organization, speaking on a number of topics. And the topics all have to have something to do with the state of Illinois. It can't just be, tigers in Uganda or something like that. It has to be related in some way to the history of the people and culture of Illinois. So that's why I'm here tonight. And it's just a pleasure to not be in some tiny rural location, but instead right here in Lake County, where I've lived for the past 38 years. I am, I think, going to just jump right into the presentation. And then as Katherine described it, why don't we, if you have a question as I'm going through my presentation, please go ahead and put it in the chat if you'd like to, or just wait till the end and we'll have a question and answer period at the end. I can always go back to an image that I've shown in my presentation if that seems to be an effective way to answer the question. So, well, let me go back and just say that the reason I'm speaking to you, Nancy described very briefly that I'm the founding curator of the Curate Postcard Archives. That came to in very, very rough condition, meaning not organized really in any way and not available to the public, way back in the first couple of months of 1983. And came to the Lake County Discovery Museum, which was the name of what is today referred to as the Bess Bauer Dunn Museum, or the Dunn Museum of Lake County. So the Lake County Discovery Museum, and now named the Dunn Museum, are both under the direction and management of the Lake County Forest Preserve District. And I was hired back when they decided to take this postcard collection from a company that operated in Chicago from 1898 to 1978 called the Curate Company. And I'll describe in a little bit what their company archives was, but that's how I got involved in postcards. I was hired to figure out this company archives and how it might be made available to the public and how to interpret it to the public. So with that, I'm going to start this evening's presentation with some general information about where postcards came from. And so postcards, the birth of postcards, if you will, picture postcards, is not at a certain moment in time or with a certain postcard, but rather kind of evolved over time. And it started with, in the 1840s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, an example of something you see on the screen. And if you look at it, you can see that it kind of looks like a postcard, but it's a little bit too long and it's a little bit too skinny top to bottom. It's not quite that 3.5 by 5.5 rectangular size that we are so familiar with as a postcard. And in fact, this isn't a postcard. This is a decorated envelope. So that's why you see the stamp and the cancellation right on the front of it. In the early days of chromolithography, and at a time before, in this country, the Civil War, and the decades before the Civil War, some parts of the middle class were beginning to travel a little bit more freely around our young country and around Europe as well. The advent of decorated envelopes and decorated letterhead came on the scene. It was something that was reasonable to purchase. Usually it was decorated with a site that you might see in the place you were visiting. And that's an example that you see here. It's kind of a timely example because it's the US Capitol building. But this is from the 1850s. And this is also kind of looks like a postcard, except the other way around, but it is likewise not a postcard. It is, instead of a decorated envelope, it's a piece of decorated letter writing paper or stationery. And you see that the image at the top, which is of the coastal area of Bournemouth on the south coast of England, is the place where the person who's writing this note is visiting at the time. So both the US Capitol one that I showed you and this one from England are both related to a person's visit to some place of some renown, whether it's natural beauty in the case of Bournemouth or whether it's a sort of a magnificent, important structure like the Capitol building. This example I'm showing you here, you can even see the date is 1861 and written on a Saturday night. And it says, "My dear George, I've been waiting to write to you for a long time. I waited till I could get a sheet of paper with a pretty picture on it." And then right at the bottom, you see a little X and it says "Our House." And if you look up at the side, right in the middle of the picture, you see a little X on the bluff. And what she's indicating, the writer is indicating there, is that that's the location of their holiday house that they've hired in the summertime in Bournemouth. So both of these examples are examples of using pictures of place and an experience of someone being in the place to correspond to somebody a long ways away. So we jump from the 1850s and 60s to 1889, and that is what most people identify as the moment of the birthplace of picture postcards as we know them today. Not an envelope, not a piece of stationery that's in an envelope and it's enclosed, but rather that 3.5 by 5.5 piece of stiffer card paper that has an image on it and a place for your message. 1889 is the year of the Paris Exposition, the most important aspect of which was the completion of the Eiffel Tower. And in 1889, the Eiffel Tower was the tallest human-made structure on the face of the earth. So unless you had occasion to go to the top of a mountain, ascending to the top of the Eiffel Tower was as high as you could get off of the planet itself. And so it was, not only is it beautiful, but it was also just a feat of engineering and something to be experienced. So the French newspaper Le Figaro published a set of postcards, and you could only purchase them if you ascended the Eiffel Tower in the little post office that's at the top of the Eiffel Tower. And maybe those who are in attendance tonight who've been to Paris and have gone to the top of the Eiffel Tower, there is still a post office there where you can cancel something and send it from the top of the Eiffel Tower. But that is the experience that the French newspaper Le Figaro put together with this new idea of picture postcards. And so 1889 in Paris at the Paris Exposition is the birth of picture postcards as we know them. Now what you're looking at here is you can tell from the way it's designed that this is a pre-1907 picture postcard. It is, as I described, 1889, but this big space on the right-hand side of the card is actually intended for your message, because between 1889 and 1907, in all countries, you could not write a message on what the post offices in all countries regarded as the business side of a postcard, which is where only the stamp and the address are placed. On this side of the postcard, on the picture side, which is the non-business side, all these early publishers allowed for a space where your message could be applied. This one obviously has not been used. This is the back of what one of those early pre-1907 postcards would have looked like. And as you can see that you just had a space for the address and then you would affix the stamp. And so consequently, people used that space, whether it were large or small, to accommodate as much of a message as they could possibly get in. Sometimes we see examples of these early postcards where the writing is tiny, just absolutely minuscule in order to fit a lot of text in this small space. And occasionally we also see examples of cross writing, which was very popular in the late Victorian and early Edwardian years, where you would write your message one direction, then you would turn the card or the piece of stationery, write it in another direction. And there are also examples where you would put it askew and write it diagonally as well. It looks like a puzzle, but actually when you turn the paper, you can make out the message, and it's a way of making the most use out of these tiny spaces. So we go from Paris in 1889 to Chicago in 1893. And this is one of the main reasons why I can speak to you about postcards through the auspices of Illinois Humanities Rhodes Scholar Program, is because Chicago and the World's Columbian Exposition are the birthplace of American picture postcards. The story is really the same as the French newspaper Le Figaro and their idea of coupling an experience of ascending the Eiffel Tower with sending this new phenomena of picture postcard. Likewise, Charles W. Goldsmith, a publisher in Chicago, got special dispensation to print a set of 10 postcards of the Columbian Exposition. And you see one before you. So Paris is regarded as the birthplace of picture postcards. Chicago is the birthplace of American picture postcards. And you can see here again that this is the non-business side, and there is that big space for the message if you wanted to send a message. So that takes us to this man. You are looking at a very young 19-year-old Kurt Otto Teich. Teich is spelled T-E-I-C-H. He was the founder of the Kurt Teich Company, which was operated in Chicago from 1898 to 1978. Kurt's father came to the World's Columbian Exposition just a few years before Kurt came to Chicago, and he went back to Germany then and told his sons that there was a lot of opportunity in the United States and specifically in Chicago, and they should all go and try and make their fortune. And they all did. They were all very successful, and Kurt was arguably the most successful of them. He came from Lobenstein in Germany. This just is a modern map of Germany, but shows where in Germany Lobenstein is located. It's a more antique map of Lobenstein. And this is a view of what it would have looked like at the time that he lived there. So let's go back to Kurt himself, though. He, after his father encouraged the sons to come to Chicago, he did. He was from a printing family. There was printing in the history of the Teich family in Germany. So it wasn't completely unusual that he would start a printing company here in Chicago. But when he got to Chicago, he founded Kurt Teich Company. It had 3 locations in Chicago, and what you're looking at here is the last of them. This is looking southeast at the corner of Irving Park and Ravenswood. So we're actually in this picture standing on Irving Park Road, and this cross street that you see to the right is Ravenswood. If any of us take the train from Highland Park, the North Line train from Highland Park down into the city, you go right by this when you cross Irving Park Road on the train, and you'll see it, and actually up on the left-hand side of the 5-story part of the building there, you still can see the sign that says Kurt Teich Direct Mail Postcards. So the building is still there, and it is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it is now apartments or condominiums, and it's called Postcard Place. But the company that Teich started when he first went into business, they were a jobber printer. He would print anything. He printed 2 German language newspapers. It was very German part of the north side of Chicago at that time. He would print business cards or a letterhead or anything that came in the door, he would print it. So he was what's referred to as a jobber printer. But fairly quickly, he latched onto this new idea of picture postcards, and he decided that that would be his niche. And absolutely it was. There is a bit of a fish story in the family. I only call it that because the dollar amounts are probably a little bit high. But the young Kurt Teich, who at the time was maybe 21 years old, so he'd been in business a couple of years, decided to take a camera himself, get on the train line, headed down to Florida. And he went all the way down to Florida and then took some weeks to get back up following the train line. And when the train would stop, he would get off and spend some time in the town with his camera, take pictures up Main Street and down Main Street and maybe the new bandstand or the new Carnegie Library. Whatever was new and important in the town, he would take pictures, and then he would go to the retailers trying to interest them in this new idea of selling postcards of their town. So here's where the fish story comes in, because the family says that he came back with $30,000 worth of orders, which in the early years of 1900 that's a lot of money. But regardless of the actual amount, the trip was successful. The idea was successful. The niche he had chosen was highly successful because eventually the Kurt Teich Company in Chicago became the largest volume producer of view and advertising postcards in the world. They had a capacity to print ultimately in the 20s, by the 20s, the teens or 20s, they had a capacity to print millions of postcards every hour in their plant. This is a picture of the very first offset press in the plant at Irving Park in Ravenswood. The man there, by the way, is not Kurt Teich. That's a pressman. It was a highly skilled job in those days and still is. And this stack of enormous sheets of paper that you see is exactly how postcards were printed then and now. They were printed many up or many on one single large sheet of paper, and then they were trimmed and cut after they were printed on these large sheets of paper. And this picture you can see at the bottom right-hand corner was taken in 1910. And so he'd only been in business doing postcards for about 5 years at the time this was taken. Ultimately, the Teich Company became best known for this kind of postcard, which is now just become an icon of 20th century American culture, really, referred to as the large letter postcard. They were the originators of this idea, they being the Teich Company, although other companies did print large letter postcards in the middle years of the 20th century. But the Teich Company printed the sort of most saturated color, largest selection and largest breadth of representation of towns and cities. But really in those early days, thinking about Kurt Teich going down to Florida and that whole trip about taking pictures in the towns, this was their bread and butter. This view, I chose it because it could be almost anywhere. It happens to be Coopersville, Michigan, but it could be Kearney, Nebraska. It could be Gurnee, Illinois. It could be many, many places in this country. But to people in Coopersville, Michigan, the detail is important. And the fact that somebody, these early postcard printers and publishers and photographers, were going around the country documenting towns and cities as they grew. Nobody thought about it as documentation at the time. It was a way to make money. It was a business idea. But what has come down to us today is a documentation of, especially the United States, in exactly the years when towns and cities were burgeoning and changing so much. So that it could be Coopersville, Michigan, or Sutersville, Pennsylvania, or it could be Highland Park, Illinois. And I went past those images kind of quickly to make the point that for us tonight, the Highland Park, Illinois one is the most important, but it doesn't vary in the aggregate from all of these images that were taken of the United States at the time when these postcard publishers and photographers were going around doing this. And the thing that's so important about it is illustrated by this image. So this is Pullman, Illinois, the Pullman Trust and Savings Bank. And I present it to you tonight because it is so commonplace. You know, you don't actually see any people in this image. It's a nice establishment. There's marble on the walls. There's these writing desks on the left-hand side there where you can write out checks and do your business, then take it over to the teller. But you take my point that whether it's Sutersville, Pennsylvania, or Cooperstown, Michigan, or Highland Park, Illinois, if postcard publishers had not been going around the country taking pictures of the interiors of these places as a business promotion for the businesses or the views of the towns and cities, we, especially in many rural locations, would not have pictures of these places. So this is the key role that postcard publishers and photographers played in the 20th century. They didn't know it at the time, but that's what has come down to us in terms of historical documentation. So whether it's a bank, a nondescript bank in Pullman, Illinois, or something very famous that's been photographed 1.5 million times, the Flatiron Building in New York City, or the Chicago Northwestern Depot in Highland Park. This is the role that postcards played. So now here's a little section that introduces us to sort of the wonderful world of all the things that have been printed on postcards in the 20th century, the good and the bad. This is one of my favorite images. It's of the All States Auto Court in Portland, Oregon. And I love it because it captures that sort of early auto tourism moment in time where you stopped as an auto tourist. You were stopping in a cozy little cottage with the little flower box in front. And I love the little cutaway that shows the hominess of the cottage that you've rented for the night as you're on your tour. So this one in particular speaks to those early days of auto tourism in the first decade, by 1920, 1919, 1920. Or this one from a little bit later, from 1939, is expressive also of America's love of the road, of the prime place that autos and automobile culture plays in the makeup of the United States. Is another of my favorite images, the Cool Motor gas station in Shreveport, Louisiana. 1939 is right in the heart of the Art Deco time period, going into streamlined deco. And that's what not only the design of the Cool Motor gas station, but the colors of the postcards itself is expressive of that time period, just as this is of 12 or 13 years earlier. Events in towns and communities of large and small have been pictured on postcards over the years. This is a particularly charming one of Pumpkin Pie Day in Longmont, Colorado. And by the way, just as a quick aside, I recently found out that Longmont, Colorado still holds Pumpkin Pie Day. This particular postcard is from 1910, but they still hold it in 2000, probably not in 2020 because of COVID, but they still do Pumpkin Pie Day. So again, the documentation value of these early images of communities, whether it's the communities themselves or the events in them, is so important. Sports were depicted on postcards here. I've show you the 1906 Chicago Cubs. And just in case any of our attendees tonight are Sox fans, I also brought the 1906 Chicago White Sox Club. But it could be something just like a pickup game. Now, this is the first one I've shown you in my presentation that is what's referred to as a real photo postcard. So this is not printed by a big publisher like the Curate Company, but rather, I think in this case, was probably taken by a person with a camera. In the early days of the early years of the 20th century, Kodak, OXO, and a couple of other publishers, AXO rather, and a couple of other not publishers, but purveyors of photographic supplies made available 3.5 by 5.5 inch photosensitive paper that was already pre-printed with the space for the address and the stamp box on one side, and then the photosensitivity on the blank side, so that anybody who had the wherewithal to develop photographs could do so on a postcard and then send them. And that's what we're looking at here. This one, I've added it to the presentation tonight because it is from Highland Park, Illinois. And also, I find it particularly charming. It says, "We'll all miss you. Come back for the game on Saturday. Boo rah rah." Highland Park, Illinois. So in this particular instance, it's the first time that we've really read somebody's message on a postcard. And that's part of the charm of postcards and the documentary power of postcards, is that it's not only about what's pictured on them or that the person sending them is having an experience, but also that they're often usually adding some sort of communication that makes this tiny piece of paper a real powerhouse of our culture. So going back to, I'm still in this little section of just showing you all the different sorts of things that have appeared on postcards. This means a lot to those of us who were raised in, the Chicago area. It's a early 1960s, or middle 1960s, I think, promotional postcard for Bozo's Circus. But it wasn't all Pumpkin Pie Day and Bozo's Circus and auto tourism and all the wonderful things about our culture. On postcards are presented many of the challenging things in our culture too. And so I've brought just, I think 4 images, postcard images tonight that touch a little bit on the African-American experience in the United States. This first one is, I don't know if anyone is familiar with this motto, "Tell 'em we're rising." I was not until I came upon this postcard. This was printed by the Curate Company. And let me just tell you a tiny bit about what this means, is "Tell 'em we're rising," the young colored Americans' message to the world. So this "Tell 'em we're rising" is a motto of a African-American leader whose name is Richard Robert Wright. He was born in 1855, so 5 years before the start of the Civil War in the South. And so was a little boy, a very little boy at the time of the Civil War. And then at the conclusion of the Civil War, when he was only 13 years old, the Union General, O.O. Howard, came down to the South during the time of Reconstruction. And it just happens that he was making a public address in the South, a public speech. And there were, hundreds and hundreds of people assembled. And this little 13-year-old boy, Richard Robert Wright, was in the crowd. And the Union General, O.O. Howard, asked the crowd specifically, he said, tell me what message I should bring up to the North. And Richard Robert Wright, this little boy, said, "Tell 'em we're rising." And that became Wright's lifelong motto. And it inspired a poem called "Howard at Atlanta," referring to this moment I just described, written by the poet James Greenleaf Whittier. And so for a generation subsequent to this time, after Richard Robert Wright became an African-American leader, this "Tell 'em we're rising" was a motto, and it inspired and motivated a whole generation, became a rallying cry. So that long description of something that until I looked into it, I had no idea what I was looking at when I saw this postcard in the Tyke archives. But it's my telling that story, I know I went into a little bit of detail, but it shows how much can be gleaned from looking at this small evidence, this small moment in time, essentially, in our culture, and all because it was printed to promote something on a picture postcard. This card, though, so we go from something that's quite positive and a very positive and constructive story of someone who became a leader and of a poet and of a general, and that was quite an inspirational story, to this postcard. It's from a series of 4 printed by the National Malleable Castings Company in Indianapolis also in about 1910. And you see along the bottom, the border says it's the colored men's dressing room. And the 4 images in this series are all from this company in Indianapolis, and they are simply of the colored and white facilities within the factory. Nobody is pictured in any of these postcards, and there is no difference in the facilities. They are simply segregated. And that's an interesting thing about what's an interesting thing about postcards, because they were printed to promote something at the time, and they're all the same size and all the same, all for the same purposes of communicating, that we see evidence of things like segregation that isn't particularly to express something. It's just a way of documenting. So this is part of the documentary character of picture postcards. But then there are also postcards that are much more pointedly expressing some ideology, I guess I'll say. This one you can see up in the upper left-hand corners from, it was published in 1923. It was printed by the Curate Company. And we know that it was printed for the KKK. And so not only is it obviously kind of disturbing that you would use a postcard format to print something like this to us today, maybe, but maybe not in 1923. But it's expressive of something that's important about the Tyke Company archives. And actually, if I could just step back, I don't think I explained at the beginning that the Tyke Company was in business from 1898 to 1978. And during all of that time, they saved examples of every postcard they printed. And they printed postcards for all the states of the United States, all the provinces of Canada, countries in Central and South America, and some other foreign countries, but all the states of the United States, some 10,000 towns and cities, businesses, and postcards like the one you see here. So thinking about Kurt Tyke as a printer makes the fact that he kept examples of everything he printed over the first 7.5 decades of the 20th century is what I call an uncurated collection. Because he would print anything that came through the door. If you had a job to print, his job, as he saw it, was to give you the best quality postcard that he could give you. And he wasn't in the business of turning jobs away. And so that's why we get something like that, and something like that, and something like that. All expressive of this, of one type of experience, but you know, from the North Pole to the South Pole in terms of aspects of the experience. And so it's one of the importances of this industrial collection is that it's not how one person or one group of people saw the United States, but rather how the entire country saw itself through bringing their individual jobs to one company to print them, and then that company saving all of these print jobs that they printed over the years. So we're jumping from something that's, you know, arguably disturbing to a little bit more about how on postcards are shown all the design trends, all the cultural trends, all the fashion trends, everything that happened in the 20th century appears in some aspect on postcards. This is a beautiful example from the Czechoslovakian artist Alphonse Mucha, who was known as one of the fathers of Art Nouveau. And then this one, just a few years later, is from the Wiener Werkstatt in Vienna, published about 1910. A lot of these I'm showing you actually are published 1910, but a different aspect of fashion. This one was printed by the Kurt Tyke Company for the manufacturer of the upholstery covers for this car. But obviously you're getting the interior view of the car, but you're also getting the fashion and sort of design of the time period, Kind of a similar time period, this wonderful view of a municipal pool with these bathing beauties in, bathing costumes at the time. And then this one from the 1971, actually, when, not just the hairstyles, not just the sort of choker jewelry, but the whole look and feel of the card and the colors are so different. I'll go back to that Art Nouveau one. So we have these delicate, organic colors in the Art Nouveau, and then this one, sharper, crisper, more German colors of the Wiener Werkstatt. This one that, has the sort of what we would term today as mid-century colors. And then this, oops, not that one. This one, a little bit later, the sharper colors of the sort of mod period. Oh, and then finally, I forgot I put this one in tonight. This postcard printed by the Tyke Company was to advertise the manufacturers of this furniture suite that you see. Again, it's sort of funny because now we would call it mid-century, but it's within my own lifetime and maybe some of the others who are attending tonight. Looks very vintage today. So if you remember the Highland Park football scene, the boo rah rah, come to the game on Saturday, I want to venture away from the Tyke Company for just a minute and from printed postcards and talk a little bit about what are referred to as real photo postcards. I described it a bit ago about how companies did provide photosensitized paper and anybody could buy it and print events as they happened in towns and cities. And that's exactly what people did. This is an example of a bridge collapse in Pennsylvania. This one, a tornado right before Easter in Omaha, Nebraska, that destroyed much of the city. This one is the destruction of liquor in front of the Montgomery County Courthouse in Independence, Kansas during Prohibition. A road building crew down in Alabama. All of these are postcards, and all of the photographs were taken specifically to be printed on postcards. This sort of charming but very naive sort of picture of the interior of a tailor's shop. This one's in Iowa. A wonderful real photo postcard view of Chinatown, where you see all of that great detail of the businesses and the cars and the people on the street. But it wasn't just places, it was also individuals. This is a real photo postcard of clearly someone who just had a camera and printed a few of these up on some sensitized postcard paper of a guy with two, he's probably a rattlesnake hunter who's got two long rattlesnakes that he got that day. So characters like this emerge in postcards. And here's two characters that mean a lot to me and are evidence of another aspect of the history of postcards. So on the right-hand side of your screen, the gentleman you see who has his hand on the chair is my great-grandfather, Andrew Jackson Salee. This was taken in Indiana, and he is my paternal grandmother's father. And you can see from his dress that he's wearing a suit and a tie, but he's also wearing a workman's cap. And so another aspect that I haven't talked about yet of postcard history is that itinerant photographers at this time, the early couple of decades before World War I really, in the United States, would go around the country with their camera, and they would stop, especially in rural locations. My grandfather lived in Indiana at the time, and he was not a man of means. And these photographers would set up shop for a week or 2 weeks or so in small towns and advertise that they were there and that people could come and have their portrait taken and printed on a postcard. And so I challenge all of you to look at your family photographs from this time period. And maybe you have a great grandfather like I do, and you just never noticed that on the back is, sure enough, a stamp box and a place for the address, and that these were printed on postcards. This particular example of my grandfather, he did write on the back of it to my grandmother that he bought 10 of them, and then he listed who he sent, to whom he sent them. So that's an example of and the other thing he described on the back of this, that's what happened, that a photographer came into town and he took advantage of it and had his postcards printed. So little could he know that his great-granddaughter, whom he never met, that would be very meaningful to him, to me, that I have evidence of this exact phenomenon in my own family history. And on the left side of the screen, you see this man's grandson, my father. And this was taken at Rockefeller Center right before he shipped out during World War II, where he served in the infantry in the Philippines. So this is also a picture postcard. And it was taken by a photographer who obviously had the the business at the top of Rockefeller Center to do just this. And it's along the lines of the paper moon in Atlantic City, where people could pose in a specific fabulous location, like looking out at the Empire State Building, and then have postcards to send back to family. So it's really no different from the Eiffel Tower. It's really of a piece. It's the same type of thing. It's experience and image and communication. This one is of not an obscure person like my great-grandfather, but rather of a very famous person, the same time period. This photograph was taken in 1921 of Benito Mussolini. It's a real photo postcard, and I'm going to, if you want to follow along, I'm going to read what's written on the back, because it's quite interesting and makes this whole piece just of such documentary power. So follow along. It's in English, and it says, "This is a recent photograph of Mussolini, a strong face, but not the brutal one caricatures make of it. Mussolini's mother taught him to read when he was 6. When he was 9, she insisted, notwithstanding his father's indifference, that he be put into a boys' school. He had a few terms in a normal school at Bologna and a few in the university at Lausanne. He is a great student of history, political economy, and languages. Of these last, he speaks 4. And at 38, he is leading Europe, some say the world." So obviously the person who wrote this message, it's handwritten in ink, so it's just somebody who bought this card, and that's what the person thinks of Mussolini at that time, 1921. And so I'm leaving real photo postcards and taking you all the way back to Paris. Just to transport you, I show you this fabulous, charming postcard of the puppet show at the Champs-Élysées. But I'm taking you back to Paris, the birthplace of postcards, in order to talk to you a little bit more about this idea of postcards encapsulating experience and image and communication. The postcard back I show you here was sent in 1907. You can actually see the postmark in the upper right hand there. And it says, "Dearest Pearl, it was a clear day in Paris. We had quite a good time in the afternoon, and we went to the very top of La Tour Eiffel." So that's 1907. And here's one from 1999. So it's exactly the same thing, almost 100 years, not quite 100 years later. And this from August 15th, 1999, you can see the postmark. It says Paris, Tour Eiffel. I am writing to you from the clouds. We're at the top of the Eiffel Tower. And so that is something that is remarkable to me. That still, I mean, just a few weeks ago, my own son was in, I guess it was over Thanksgiving, so it was a few months ago. My own son, who's 25, was in South Dakota visiting the Mount Rushmore. And he, in the gift shop, bought me a postcard and sent me a postcard from Mount Rushmore. It's the exact same thing. It is unchanged. We don't send them as much as we did in the heyday of postcards, but the same reasons we send them are endure. And so it is one of the most enduring types of communication in the 20th and now 21st century. So just a little bit more of all the types of imagery that we find on postcards. This one from, let's see, this is the year that the Beatles played Ed Sullivan, so 1964. This is printed by the Curate Company. And then 30 years later in 1994, so not the Tyke Company, but still a postcard. This is the year the Rolling Stones came out with Voodoo Lounge, their album Voodoo Lounge. But those two postcards, both postcards, are exactly the same, except that different band, different album, but separated by 30 years. The reasons to do it, the promotional reasons, are the same. Politics have figured largely on postcards and still figure on postcards. I'll show you an example here in a minute that's from only a few years ago. This one is an English example, encouraging people to vote conservative. These next two are American examples. This one of the Eisenhower family, and this one of the Nixon family, both picture postcards. Going from the conservative and Republican side over to the Democratic side, this is for a son of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson. And back to England, this is one of my favorite political postcards, only because the image is so powerful. This is obviously printed by the conservatives, because what you're looking at is former Prime Minister Tony Blair, and then the message there is you peel away and he's evil behind it. So you can see that we go from images that are much more benign, sort of just showing, in the case of the Nixon family or the Eisenhower family, just solid family values, that sort of thing, to something that's a much more pointed imagery. And then the next one I warn you is of immediately former President Trump and Vladimir Putin. But this is a postcard printed in early 2016, which is interesting to me because it was before the 2016 election. But this is still a picture postcard, and obviously still a very pointed message on it that expresses a political viewpoint. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about collecting postcards. What you're looking at here is a typical album at the turn of the century, at the time we refer to as the golden age of postcards. They didn't call it that then, but people who collect postcards today do call postcards from 1898, from those early Parisian postcards, to really the First World War is referred to as the golden age, because everybody was collecting postcards at that time. There were postcard exchanges, such as the one you're looking at here in Alabama, where that's all you would do is buy postcards. People collected postcards, and very much they put them in albums like this. It was a form of parlor entertainment before the radio, certainly before television, that if guests came over, 15 years or 20 years before, you would have pulled out the stereopticon. And in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, you would pull out your postcard album. So people were collecting them. You could buy them everywhere. This is a wonderful real photo postcard view of the interior of a stationery store. But if you see there on the left, the Ferris wheel display rack of postcards, and there's another smaller display rack there, you literally could buy them everywhere. And people sent them for quite regular, ordinary correspondence, because in these days, most places got 2 postal deliveries a day, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And so it's quite common around between 1900 and 1910 for people to write on postcards, "Dear Mabel, coming on the train at 2:15, remember to bring the eggs." They actually used them not unlike how we use texting today, that it wasn't quite that immediate, but you could send it in the morning and your recipient could get it in the afternoon within your rural district, of course. So those are the average people who collected postcards, and maybe many of the attendees tonight collected them, or their aunts or parents or grandparents did. There are also people, especially today, who collect them very systematically. The man you're looking at here is Leonard Lauder, and his mother was Estee Lauder, founder of the Estee Lauder Cosmetic Company. And Mr. Lauder that you're looking at here, who's now in his early 80s, because of the success of the company, and he's chairman emeritus of the Estee Lauder companies today, he has an enormous amount of wealth. And so what he's standing in front of is a Picasso painting, a Cubist painting, one of a collection of, I think, 22 such paintings by Picasso and Braque and Leger that he recently gave to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So he is a collector of the highest end fine art, but he also collected, and he started his collecting desire when he was a little boy collecting postcards. And here's one of these. This is a real photo postcard that he bought down in Miami Beach. He and his family would go down there in the wintertime to spend when he was a little boy. And he just became enchanted with not only the place itself, but the postcards that were available everywhere at that time. And so he began collecting. And over the years, he still collects today, both fine art paintings and postcards. Over the years, he put together one of the most distinguished private postcard collections in the world. So you'll recognize this woman. You saw her a little bit earlier. She's was one of a set of postcards printed by the Wiener Werkstatt in Vienna between 1903 and the First World War. I show her as, I'm showing a few examples of what Mr. Lauder collects. So he collects the Wiener Werkstatt postcards. The one on the left, by the way, is an Easter postcard. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that those are all egg shapes. So this is that Viennese circa 1910 aesthetic of sharp colors, crisp lines, but that's actually an Easter card. It's very beautiful. He collects Japanese art cards. This one is a silkscreen print. It says, you even see in English, it says a country view of Japan. You can, now everyone now knows, if you didn't before, that the reason why there's this space at the bottom is you can tell at a glance that this postcard was printed before 1907 because it has that large space that was intended for your message. I have a few examples of Mr. Lauder's Japanese collection. This one is from the Tournament of the Far Eastern Athletes, which was the date of 1912. And then this very beautiful view of the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. It's just the view itself is beautiful, but the structure, if you don't know it, and maybe attendees tonight do, but that is a Frank Lloyd Wright designed structure in Tokyo. He also collects what are called woven in silk postcards. So you see this is a postcard. It's 3.5 by 5.5 inches in size. And you can see that it looks like almost like a little picture frame. And indeed, that's what it is. There's a type of silk weaving called Jacquard weaving that was developed in France. And they started out weaving figurative designs on ribbon. What I'm showing you is ribbon with just floral designs. You see the front of the pink example on the right-hand side shows the front face of the ribbon that would be on a hat or on a dress or on a jacket. And then you see the back side of it on the lower left there where it shows the underside of the weaving that goes into the figurative design. Well, an Englishman called by the name of Stevens in England realized that these could be not just floral, but could be figurative. And so he got the idea of not doing designs like a flower or fruit or something that's just decorative, but doing images. And eventually also place the images in a little mat. So and then mounting them on with a postcard back and putting them together as another type of postcard. These are very popular for a short time after the beginning of the 20th century. Obviously, the one for the Titanic is extremely valuable today, but they were pretty much designed and printed for most steamships that cross the Atlantic, such as this one that you see the front and back of. And this is for the Royal Majesty ship Baltic. And you can see that it goes between, that's not Norway. What flag is that? Is that Finland? I'm not sure. I should find that out. But it goes between the United States and wherever the ship is registered. So the nationality of the ship in the United States. So both the views of the ship themselves and also these, what are referred to as hands across the sea. But that little inset is woven in silk. And this is a type of postcard that is collected by Mr. Lauder. I'm going away from Mr. Lauder's collection to just show a few other types of collections, private collections that we added to the industrial archives of the Tyke Company. So to go back to how we processed the Tyke Company collection, we started to provide access to it about 4 years after we received it physically. And then I would say another 4 years after that, so maybe we'd had the Tyke Company archives about 8 years, we began to attract other collections to the archives and grow the whole archives so that it expressed the idea of picture postcards in a larger sense, not just the Tyke Company. And so here are some examples of a few of, besides Mr. Lauder's collection, a few of the types of collections that we added to that Tyke Company archives. One is a beautiful collection, wonderful collection of real photo postcards associated with the suffragette movement. There's another collection of postcards associated with these gospel preachers who would go around the United States, not proselytizing, that sounds negative, but trying to preach their gospel, and that was the way they made their living. And as you can see, this example here, he's got a mission service that's coming up the night that this picture was taken. We have a wonderful collection of Santas, and I show you this one. It's a very valuable example because his coat is purple instead of red. So if you collect Santa Clauses, which a lot of people do, and especially and a lot of people collect postcard Santa Clauses, the more unusual, the more valuable, just in general terms. A wonderful collection called the Grant Schmalgemeyer Century of Progress collection. Grant Schmalgemeyer was a Chicago native. He's deceased. He's been deceased for about 20 years or so, but he was an avid collector of all the postcards associated with the 1933-1934 Chicago World's Fair. This is just one wonderful example. And there's another collection within the archives of just postcards of amusement parks, not expositions, not World's Fairs, but amusement parks such as White City in Chicago, Disneyland in California, Coney Island, Steeplechase Park, also on Coney Island. And he collected any postcards of any amusement park anywhere in the world. And then finally, the James Powell Route 66 collection. Route 66 originates in Chicago and goes to Santa Monica Pier out in California, or the other way around, I guess. And James Powell is another postcard collector who decided to focus on Route 66 and tried to collect every postcard printed for along Route 66, motels, views of the road, towns and cities. I mean, really, there's no way he could collect everything, but he collected hundreds of thousands of examples and I'll show you just a few of them here. Wonderful views of some of these places. This is Winslow, Arizona. I love this one especially because it kind of takes me back to my baby boomer years, I guess, and thinking about my father's early cars. And there's something about the neon and the cars parked in front of this charbroiled steaks venue that is especially appealing. This one is one of my favorites, even though it's a black and white real photo postcard, so not nearly the sort of charm of the color that we just saw, but I love it because it says, you know, you can get everything here. There's a coffee shop, there's a refined cocktail bar. I love that they term it refined, even though it's out in the middle of nowhere. We've got Fred Laskowski, who will play the organ at your request. We have arts and crafts. There's someplace you can stay nearby. And it's all here on Route 66. Now, this one is especially appealing just because it seems like it's out in the middle of nowhere in the desert, and yet all of this is available. It kind of is a little tiny encapsulation of the experience of riding on Route 66, or what we think about the idealized experience, I guess I should say. So I just have two more sections, and one of them is to show you something else that the Tyke, going all the way back to the Tyke Company collection. Not only did Kurt Tyke instruct that examples of everything they printed should be saved in scrupulous order, chronological order, but he also instructed that they save the art files that went into making the postcards in these early years. So I'm going to show you one example of what's in some of these art files. There are 125,000 of these art files, and this is one of them. So this is the finished postcard. Kirk's Better Foods in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It was printed in the 1950s. So look at it for a minute. It seems like a nice place, just a little coffee shop up in town. Sioux Falls, South Dakota in 1950 was, rural farming community. So this is the photograph. Remember that the Tyke Company is printing these cards in Chicago. So this is the photograph that the client, Kirk, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, has to send to Chicago to turn it into a postcard. And what they have is I think that the postcard's going to be in color. The photograph is black and white. So not only do they send the photograph, but they send instructions as to what to do to the photograph, what the client, Kirk in this case, how he wants it changed. Now look at this photograph a little bit. You see behind where the waitress is standing, there's a rag that's fallen on the floor. Right in the middle center in the foreground is the bus tray, the bus cart with the bus trays on it. You've got this lady in the center of the counter there who's kind of got a hunched back. One of the things you may notice is that wall, that big blank wall on the upper right-hand side is blank. And then you've got some people either coming or going at the front door there. So we turn on the back side of this photograph, handwritten, are the instructions from the client. And you'll see that they describe some of it, that it's a dark green ceiling, that the top walls are light green, the seats are light buff. And so it's describing all the details so that the printer can get the color right. But notice that last instruction, it says, remove farmer at door. And sure enough, they're going to take him out. This is the retouched photograph, and the bus tray is cropped out, the cloth that's fallen on the floor is gone. There's new wallpaper up there on the wall, and the farmer and all of his friends are gone. I've always thought that it was funny that in Sioux Falls in 1950 something, that I should think you would want farmers in your coffee shop, but the farmer is gone. And it was expressed in no uncertain terms, remove farmer at door. And not only do we have these instructions and this original photograph, but we also have a piece of the actual new wallpaper that they were going to put on that wall in Kirk's. And that's probably why they published the postcard, because they're redoing the place. But that's something that's also in these art files, are pieces of wallpaper or carpet or upholstery or whatever the client thought the printer would need in order to get the color right. So now this is my last little section. I'm going to take you to Highland Park a little bit. We're not in Highland Park yet. I think all of us who have any experience in Chicago can recognize that this is the fabulous Marshall Field's flagship store on down in Chicago. It's just such a beautiful sort of palatial view that it kind of brings us back, in this case from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, back to Chicago. But I pulled off the internet some examples of Highland Park postcards just to quickly go through them and bring all of these ideas and all of this documentary value of postcards back home to all of us. Great view of Central Avenue. This is a real photo postcard. Two views of the Shoreline Lodge on the Skokie Valley Road. This is one of my favorites because it's just so, it's funny because it's taken in this, just like it was taken yesterday, you know, with the dirty piles of snow that have been sort of thrown against the edge of the roadway by the plows. And just very unusual to have a promotional postcard of a place like this from a wintertime scene. But here we have it in the summertime, printed about the same time, actually. This is a much more typical view of a place like a motel. The interior of the Hotel Moraine. It's a beautiful, sort of fresh, crisp, ready for the customers to show up and have their iced tea. And then I was communicated with by the archivist at the Exmoor Country Club when he found out that I was going to speak to the Historical Society this evening. And we had a nice communication about a couple of weeks ago, and he sent me a couple of postcards that they have in the archives there of Exmoor. And I selected a couple of them to showcase tonight that I think are especially intriguing. This is a real photo postcard, but it's a very dynamic composition. It's one of my favorite real photo postcards that I've seen, with that enormous flag and the sunshine on that step and the high portico, and just something about the summertime grandeur of this place that's captured in this tiny 3.5 by 5.5 image. There's also this one, which seems like it's not a particularly dynamic image, but I love it also because this is the dance floor, but it's so summertime to me. I can almost feel the hot weather, and there's the golf course that's spread out in the distance. And just thinking about a summertime dance being held on the weekends at the Exmoor Country Club in, let's say, 1957 or something, just very, very charming view. And then to go away from Exmoor, I'll return to it in just a minute. And not quite Highland Park, but right on the border is this great view from the 1960s of Ravinia Festival. This is the back of the same card. This particular one was published by the Type Company. And then back to Exmoor. This is the other one that I chose from Exmoor because it, again, it doesn't seem like it's a particularly dynamic postcard, certainly not like the one with the flag and the portico and the steps. But in my communication with the archivist, he told me, he and I went back and forth a little bit because I studied at St. Andrews University in Scotland for a few years as a university student. And so he and I went back and forth a little bit about that. And he mentioned that some of the design of the Exmoor Country Club course layout, and then some of the early professionals there were from Scotland. And as you're looking at this postcard, the bunkers, I guess, or the hazards that you see on the left-hand side, those two long, I don't even know how to describe them, but sort of like, it looks like heaps of dirt, but of course it's a hazard, are called copses. And that is a sort of now antiquated type of hazard on a golf course. And as he described it to me, it wasn't shortly after this postcard was printed that the course design changed, and those old-fashioned, by that time outdated design of a course was changed. And so this image, while it's not a particularly dynamic image, has documentary value of a kind that we couldn't, that even the photographer did not anticipate. But sure enough, because we're recording pictures of place at a certain time, all in the same format, that we have a huge evidence of change in American culture. And I just love this one. It's kind of a subtle example of it. There's the detail showing those copses. So postcards are wonderful. They're whimsical. I haven't even talked really at all about just those that are produced, whether a real photo postcard like this one, which is hand retouched with that color added, for the pure whimsy of it. They're not advertising anything. They're not about experience. They don't document anything. They just are charming. And this is a perfect example of this little girl is blowing bubbles and sitting on a toadstool. Or this one, which in postcard collecting terms is called a novelty card, because it has affixed to it something actually dimensional. In this case, real feathers are affixed to the postcard. And then I think it's two last ones to show that everybody sends postcards. I do. My son sent them from Mount Rushmore just a few months ago. And here's one that was sent from Pablo Picasso in 1907 to his great friend, the art critic and artist Guillaume Apollinaire. And isn't this a fabulous example of someone who in 1907 was not famous yet, but the little drawing that Pablo Picasso added to the postcard was his entire message. And it's so expressive of his aesthetic at the time he sent this to his friend. And then 10 years later, here's another postcard from Picasso to Apollinaire, sent in 1918. Completely different aesthetic, completely evocative of how his own style changed. So whether you look at it from the evidence it gives of an artist's work, or whether you just look at it from the absolute charm that famous people, plain old people, everybody sends postcards for exactly the same reason since the time they were invented to just a few months ago, is just very powerful, I think. So the postcard collection now is, we being the Lake County Forest Preserve District, gave the collection to the Newberry Library down in Chicago in 2016. And I just show you this facade of the beautiful Newberry Library, and just a quick glimpse of their website there where you see it says Kurt Teich Archives Collection, because the postcards were recently named the 11th core collection of the Newberry Library, right up there with early modern literature and genealogy and cartography and all the other fabulous and much more traditional areas of study have recently been added postcards. And it's because of the Kurt Teich postcard collection. And so I think, oh, it's just another great view of the Newberry. So that concludes my remarks, but I would be happy to answer any questions that anyone has. And
by the way, they said members of the Denver Postcard Club are here tonight.
Really?
So
I would have added Denver. I can do this for Denver, you know, absolutely. Because now that we're on Zoom, I can go anywhere. That's the thing. That's the fun of this.
Okay, so William Schultz said, as a longtime postcard collector, including visiting the large collection at the Lake County Discovery Museum, I'm aware of extensive I'm aware of extensive pre-1893 cards in Europe, mainly Germany, but don't know where to get these or learn more about them. Any tips or contacts? And perhaps, you know, the people from Denver might have a comment as well to add to this.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much available. If you mean to purchase, there's so much available online. I mean, really, you would just have to put in your search for whatever it is you're trying to find. But it used to be back in the day, and certainly now with COVID, everything has changed, but there used to be postcard shows, and there used to be 2 in Chicago every year that were very well attended. We had dealers coming from all over the United States. Certainly we had a number coming from Europe just for the show. There was a big show in New York City called the Metropolitan Postcard Club show, and all over the place. They were really wonderful because you could just spend the whole day, sit down in front of a dealer, take a box of postcards, and unless you were really on the hunt for something, you could just say, you know, you can just follow your nose. You find the most amazing things that you never knew you would be enchanted by. Today, the internet has replaced that largely. There are so many postcard dealers out there. And I think to begin to source a specific type of card, a good way to do that would be to do a search for postcard dealers and then just ask, there aren't that many of them, and just ask, you know, this is the kind of card I'm looking for. What do you have? And just sort of, you know, poke around almost like you would search for anything, whether it's a 1957 Danish coffee table or some type of postcard. I think you just have to kind of start your hunt.
Okay, so Maggie Thompson on the Facebook page said, obviously, since they kept a copy of each postcard, the people who ran the company had an interest in preserving historical documentation.
Yes, that's a fascinating remark, and thank you for making it. Often when I've spoken to audiences, they will say, well, that he was German, and so he was very regimented and, you know, kind of had everything organized. I never met Kurt Teich. He died in 1974 and, or 1978, pardon me. And everything I understand about him, though, was that he was just a very organized person. When the collection came to us, we didn't have very much information about it, but it did have numbering systems. We had to figure out what they were, but once we were able to do that, we were able to process and the collection, provide access to it pretty quickly. So no doubt that way back in his head, somehow he decided from card one that he would save examples, and thereby he put together this company archives. And for us today, as a huge documentary collection, we are the great beneficiaries, because unlike a company that knits socks or makes widgets for some type of machinery, his stock in trade was pictures of the world as it was changing from 1898 to 1978. And I know I've put the bookends on those years several times, but I think they're important because the 20th century was a time of unprecedented change physically. Now we're in sort of an unprecedented change time technologically, but the physical built environment changed so much from, 1900 when to then cars and airplanes, and, it just sort of began to take on a life of its own. And it just happened that those two things came together, like the planets aligned. We're going to do this new thing, make not cheap, but inexpensive, highly available imagery of place. And it just happened in a good way and we're the beneficiaries.
By the way, I know Cynthia Clampett's on tonight, and she's also another Illinois Rhodes Scholar, but she's made the observation in the past, and it's startling, is when Frank Lloyd Wright and Laura Ingalls Wilder were born 4 months apart.
Wow, really?
Yes. That's a Cynthia. I'm giving her all attribution, but that's the most startling thing I've heard in a long time when she presented that a year or two ago.
Not only both 4 months apart, but both in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Sometimes the planets align. What can I say?
The Little House on the Prairie and the Prairie Style House.
So I saw, there was that postcard from the Baltic line, and you weren't sure what flag it was.
Oh, yeah.
It was identified as being from Sweden.
Oh, thank you so much. I should have known. IKEA, blue and yellow, should have known. My mind went blank. What can I say?
It happens. Where was the Putin and Trump postcard printed? Russia or the United States? Or somewhere else?
I believe it was printed in France. So that's interesting. I should look that up because I've had that question before, and I need to look it up. I don't have that postcard physically, so I don't know.
By the way, somebody commented they're from the San Jose, California Postcard Club.
No kidding. Hi. Hi from Illinois. I can speak in San Jose. My sister lives there, so.
We actually have the president also. He's here, Mr. Schmalgemeyer. So yes, there's a couple of us, I think. But nice to meet you.
My brother-in-law is the chair of the history department at San Jose State University.
Nice.
Glenn Genzel. I'll have to tell him that I had San Jose people. I can do it for San Jose too, and I'll add.
we were going back and forth saying that, oh, this would be great.
Yeah.
So we'll have to get your email.
Our acting Denver president Beth is on here as well. So here in Denver.
And Susan B. Postcards on Standards along State, Dearborn, and Randolph is here tonight too.
Hi, Catherine.
Susan Benjamin, I see you, Susan. Hello, my dear.
Yeah, 20 years ago, we created these standards along the street when they were taking the mall out of State Street, and we selected postcards to illustrate the history of the streets. So I think they're still there. I hope they're still there.
I'm
you
sure
know,
they are.
but they are just, I mean, what a great source. I mean, it has been absolutely fantastic. And then on the side is at Kurt Teich's house is standing along, I can't remember the name of the street, Longwood or Long Meadow or Long in Glencoe. And so it's a very impressive sort of an Italian palazzo. And it's there and it's beautiful.
It is beautiful. You can drive right by it. I don't remember the street myself.
It's the one that parallels the
on-
lake.
It's on 535 Longwood.
Oh,
There we go.
I'm impressed.
We
Fantastic.
renovated the house. It's quite a house. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Oh, I was in it. Part of the Historical Society had a tour a couple of years ago. Was it
Yeah.
maybe?
You are
2016?
Scott. Hi.
Hi, Susan. How are you?
Magnificent, really beautiful work. It was a thrill to be in the house, I have to
It's
say.
pretty amazing. We have a family scrapbook too that came along with it, which the Historical
Oh, nice.
Society has. So pretty
Excellent.
amazing. Yeah.
Oh, of the Teich family?
Mhm.
I don't
Yeah.
know if Newberry knows that, so it might be interesting for them to know that. If anyone who's attending tonight needs to get in touch with Alice Schreyer, so it's Alice SCHREYER. She's the vice president of Reader Services, I believe.
So another question, where does a person donate postcards? How should they be curated before one donates or asked if an organization wants them?
Well, we always say, I mean, back when we were, when we still had the collection, we were regularly offered very systematic collections like the Schmalgemeyer Century of Progress collection, obviously is a jewel, or the Route 66 collection, which is amazing. And then sometimes we get people who just had, their Aunt Martha passed away and she collected postcards and she was 100 and we would go through them at the item level not the systematic collections were always cataloged, but so I don't think the Newberry is doing that currently. I mean, when they literally, the collection we gave them is about 3.5 million items. It is a very large collection. So I think they are still sort of coming to grips with how they want to move forward with their collecting scope, and where, their curators have to get a sense of what isn't represented in the collection currently, where would they like to add to it. And so I don't believe that they're looking at just non-systematic collections at this point. But that said, even back when we were collecting, we'd pull out the ones that we thought had added to the Teich archives. But then with the remainder, we would try to help people to think through where they might be best placed. And if you have a collection, let's say of, I don't know, Kearney, Nebraska. I was born in Kearney. I know I mentioned that earlier, but so I was born in Kearney. If someone came to us in Illinois with Aunt Martha's collection, and a lot of it was sort of middle Nebraska towns, Minden, Kearney, Grand Island, those towns right in the middle of the state, the Platte River, Mormon Trail, that sort of thing, we would often suggest, before even looking at the collection, that a better placement would be at the local historical society. So San Jose, Denver, wherever it would be best used is what I think not only people who are thinking to donate, but also the archivists and curators and museum directors who are looking at collections, is to always place them where they will be most in keeping with the people who are going to come there. And so I think with everyone, think through where, think through the collection. If there is any kind of regionality to it, that's always your best place, especially with these beautiful real photo postcards, because they are magnificent documents of the most benign places that may otherwise not be documented. Like that bank in Pullman, Illinois. Come on, kids. That is not an interesting view, but it is to Pullman.
Absolutely. This probably is redundant. You may have just answered, but maybe there's a nuance I didn't. So what is the grand total of different Kurt Teich cards? How many different images are in the collection, and are there some which elude you? Which, in a sense, you may have answered, but I'm not sure.
You know, it is kind of, I sometimes used to say uncountable millions, but that didn't seem to satisfy anybody. Of individual images, if memory serves, it was around like 410,000, something like that. And then, you know, what we did was the tyke amassing was 15 examples of everything. Now, 15 examples don't exist of the very earliest ones, like cards number 1 through 126 or something like that. Those are all only in an album. The tyke company put them in the album, but so there is a card 1. Oh, and that's interesting too. I didn't talk about the numbering systems, but you can tell the date of publication of a tyke postcard just from that number. Did you see on the bottom of, let's say, remember the Cool Motor gas station in Shreveport, that really beautiful streamlined deco? So on the bottom of that, on the lower right-hand border, there was a number, and I think it was 6AH something. I don't remember what the last digits were. So that's an example of a tyke code that they started in 1930. The A refers to the decade. So A is the 30s, B is the 40s, C is the 50s, D is the 60s, E is the 70s. And then the number in front of that letter gives you the year and the decade. So 6A means that card was printed in 1936. 6B would be 46, etc. The H refers to the type of card, or if there's no H, that also refers to a type of card, but the H refers to that linen style. Highly saturated, super colored, like the Puxatawny PA large letter card. That's a linen, what's called a linen card. And then the series of numbers after it, and I don't remember what the Cool Motor one was, but let's say it was 692. So 692 means that that postcard was the 692nd job printed in that style, the linen style, in the year 1936. And all of their numbering systems, I mean, they started with card 1. That really, literally, the first card they printed was number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then they started differentiate. He saw that it was successful and he started differentiating into different kinds of series. And each series he would give another numbering system to. So 1A, you know, he just did that. And we figured out all of those different codes and what all of them meant. And we passed all of that along to the Newberry. So that's, you can easily find that at the Newberry Library. It might even be online. I haven't looked for it, but if you ever encounter a tyke card, like in the San Jose collection or in one of your private collections, you can always date the publication of the card from that number. And all of the numbers are on this dating guide. We called it the dating guide.
So how about giving away postcards? Anyone can donate? Cynthia, if you're still there.
Yeah, well, I just noticed somebody just typed up regarding where to donate. It is important to emphasize matching.
Oh, that was me, the archivist.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, because it's always, whether they're postcards or something else or scrapbooks. If it's hot, we have
They're from everywhere. My grandmother traveled a lot. I traveled a lot. Most of them are before the 70s. Some of them are weird things like copper. So
Yeah.
I wasn't looking for a place to make a contribution like that. I was thinking if there was somebody who loved postcards, I'd go here.
Yeah. Well, dealers are always happy to take your cards. And if you can't find one that, as Nancy Webster is saying to everyone, like I was mentioning earlier, look for where they'll get the most use. If you try to get them to a repository of some kind, I think is a good idea. But if you've got cards that, you know, are just kind of, they're not pegged to a place in any way or to a theme other than postcards themselves, like the example of that little girl that's blowing the bubbles, you know, that doesn't, unless we could identify where it was printed or who the printer was, you know, it's just a postcard. It's a fun postcard, but it's a postcard. So you can sell them. and they do have value. And you can communicate with a dealer, and I have found that all postcard dealers are reputable. I mean, I'm sure there are some who are not.
Like
but
I said, I was just hoping for somebody who went, oh, I love all postcards, and I would just hand them the collection and I wouldn't have to worry about it anymore.
Well, I'll
Selling
tell
it.
you, at the Denver Postcard Club, we're happy to take donations.
There we go.
Everyone,
Yay! Match made in heaven.
I did have a question that was not answered. That is there a card that eludes you at all? Is there something that you don't have an example of that you're looking for?
Well, I mean, if I had stayed with the archives, or rather I should say if the archives had stayed with, I mean, I'm not in charge of it anymore, obviously, but I guess I would love to have continued. It was really, really fun working with people who collect systematically, like Mr. Lauder. And I mean, that was just really fun. Their body and soul, hook, line, and sinker into this, just like many collectors are, like James Powell, who collected Route 66. Route 66 postcards is a bottomless pit. You cannot collect everything related to Route 66, because where do you stop? I mean, do you stop at just views of the town that don't show the road, or, you know, it's hard to stop. But what these systematic collectors have done for those of us who research what, you name it, whatever it is, whether it's a type of architecture or a route or whatever it is, we are hugely the beneficiaries of their passion and their single-minded drive. And it was a lot of fun to acquire those collections, to work with the collectors themselves, because they know every nuance about every single card, you know, that this one has a little this, and that was a lot of fun. And I love the 2 Picasso cards I showed at the end. I mean, I think it would have been really fun to launch into have an aspect of the collection that relates more to who was writing the cards, and sort of explore that end of it a little bit. But I'm not a professional postcard collector anymore.
Katherine, you know, there's one part of the story I don't think you mentioned tonight, and I've heard your lecture before, but maybe it's something to tell you how close the Kurt Teich collection could have gone to landfill.
Oh, so close. Yeah, I didn't talk about that. So when Kurt Teich died in 1978, all this stuff was still in that building that I showed you at Irving Park in Ravenswood. It was just all still in there. And in the years immediately, and I mean immediately following his father's death, Kurt Teich Jr., who was the eldest son, there were 4 children. The eldest son, Kurt Jr., was sort of in charge of the company, even though Ralph, the youngest son, was also working for the company. But Kurt Jr. was kind of in charge, and he was a very secretive person. And I didn't meet him either, but from all I have heard, he was, I don't know, I don't want to belittle someone whom I never met, but kind of had too many idiosyncrasies, and was kind of had his ways, I guess I'll say. And he began to destroy the collection because he thought it had either no value or was had too many secrets. I don't know which was his problem, but he started to destroy it. And he was successful. And he started, unfortunately, with the glass plate negatives. And I've often thought that you could actually easily, I think, go back into the refuse schedule for 1979, 1980, when they were collecting garbage and where they took it from the back of that plant on Irving Park in Ravenswood, and figure out where those glass plate negatives are. But that's, they're probably buried too deep. But he did start to destroy them, and he started there. And then the youngest son, Ralph, is really the one who should be accredited with all of this, because he put a stop to his brother's destruction of the archives. And he started to look around to find some place, some institution that would take this collection. And he himself, Ralph, first he went to the Chicago Historical Society, it was called at that time. Now it's called the Chicago History Museum. And the photo curator there, Larry Viscachel, great guy, but he did say at that time he would only take the views of Chicago, did not want the whole collection. Now that was a collecting scope decision that he made, right or wrong, but he said no. And Ralph, to his credit, did not want to give Chicago theirs and Pittsburgh theirs and San Jose theirs and Denver theirs and tear apart what had been amassed innocently all these years as this huge documentary collection, as opposed to having it be views of all these places. And so he continued to look for a place that would understand that it was important, that what has come down to us was important from a documentary point of view, and it should be saved. And so he went to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which seems like a logical place, but they don't have collections. And he did not know that. He said their response was very positive, but they don't have collections. So he lived in Lake County, lived in Lake Forest, actually right up the road from Highland Park. And he came to the Forest Preserve District's museum, and this is way back in 1982 when it was in a rural location in a forest preserve in a converted barn. And the director of the museum at that time convinced the county board, the Forest Preserve Board, that it should be saved and that it would sort of put the museum on the map. Now the Dunn Museum would not make that collecting decision today. But the museum at that time was not as mature as it is now. It's an accredited museum. Then it was a much smaller organization, although run professionally. And they did take the collection. And in making that one move, they created everything that I just described in this magnificent body of material that is unparalleled anywhere in the world. And it's now at the Newberry Library, freely available. But that was that one decision. I think that that's so fascinating in history. For all of us here tonight, we must all love history. We must all be driven by the past and the present and how it all comes together and informs each other, and that there's a yin and yang to it. And I'm fascinated by this one example of how so often it hangs on one tiny thing, that somebody kicked over a rock at Sutton Hoo, and underneath it was this huge body of early Anglo-Saxon gold and garnet jewelry and a sword. It's just some tiny thing that happens, and then something else happens. And this is a good example of it, because thank you for bringing that up, Katherine. I didn't tell that story, but it's pretty remarkable. One man saved this particular collection from absolute destruction, and then put a little effort into it. And today we have something that's really cool.
By the way, why don't you add what it was like to be on the receiving end of that collection when it first arrived?
Well, I was only 7 at the time. No, I didn't know what I was doing. No, so I was still a graduate student, and I was just owing the government some money. And so I was looking for a job before I finished I was in the middle of my doctorate, and I looked in the Chicago Tribune, and they're under archivist, because I was looking under artist, and they were next door to each other, was this small want ad from the Lake County Forest Preserve District. Person needed to catalog postcards. And I thought, oh, postcards, I like postcards. That sounds interesting. And so I was not an archivist at the time. I'm a certified archivist now, but I was not. I was studying art history, but I wasn't an archivist. And so the Forest Preserve hired me, and they had already identified a building which was converted on the same campus as where the museum is, but a separate building. And so I think what Katherine is asking me to tell you is that when just the industrial collection came up from Chicago, it came up over 5 days. And on day 1, at about 9 in the morning, a full-size Mayflower moving van pulls up in front of this little farmhouse, and they opened the side doors to the van, and flush to the size of this van was the materials, and they had to start bringing cases out in order to unload the whole thing. And that went on for 5 days. So on day 1 we had nothing, and on day 5 we had 5 Mayflower moving vans of like paper everywhere. It was archival triage, just like, oh, put those there and put those upstairs. And then we had a house full of stuff, and then little by little we figured it out, just like we all do, right? You have enormous bodies of material. You got to start somewhere. You begin to untangle that ball of yarn.
Unbelievable. That's really a legacy project for you, wasn't it?
I would call it life work.
There is actually one last question, if you don't mind. Are collectors more interested in the images or the cards themselves? The reason I ask is that when I was younger, I amassed a collection of 3,000 or so cards covering all sorts of subjects, types, and if there was a place I could upload and share the images, I'd happily do so.
I would say generally that the value is almost always on the image. Not always, but maybe those who are, I think the Denver person left, but those who are actual postcard collectors, my experience is that the messages are interesting to people, and there are lots of people who research them and write about it, but it's the value is usually driven by the image itself. I guess that's what I would say.
Because there were a lot of compliments, but compliments times infinity. Everybody really appreciated your talk tonight. Oh, fantastic.
It's been my pleasure to be with everyone. As you can tell, I love postcards, and I love talking about them, and I love hearing from others too about what they're encountering. And I've said once or twice how everyone who's here tonight loves history, but I'm pretty sure that's a good guess, that it's what drives us, and it's a passion, and it's a huge universe of things to be discovered. So I'm always grateful to be amongst so many people who feel similarly about whatever body of material drives them. Because I can see now Charlotte Renahan from Grays Lake. Is that you, Charlotte? I think that's Charlotte. Yep, it is. And San Jose, I'm so excited.
I just wanted to interject as a writer and like to write poetry, that these postcards certainly would generate, or do generate, a lot of inspiration for writers as well. You know, make the arts talk to each other, and I think they're really wonderful for that too.
That's a good point. And that's another aspect that I did not speak about, is postcards as inspiration for art. In fact, if anyone is interested to email me, I can send them a link to a panel. I was a participant at the Newberry Library, I think 2 years ago, but it's a panel of 3 speakers. You'll get a smaller version of the presentation that I made tonight, but then there's also 2 other speakers. And one of them speaks specifically about postcards as an inspiration for artists. And she is the curator of the Roger Brown Study Collection at the Art Institute of Chicago. And then also Michael Jackson, a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, who was the chief architect for the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, is the 3rd speaker. So if you want to email me, I can just send that link. And there's a lot of interesting back and forth in the panel. And there is some discussion about postcards as an inspiration to and a jumping off place for art and the creation of art. So if you're interested in that, I can send you that too.
I will email you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, time for a glass of wine, everybody.
You probably need the deep pour. Thank you again so much. And I want to tell you, we had as many as about 110 people or 10 devices linked on tonight. And right now we're still at around 50. So that tells you the real believers are still here, the true believers.
Great job.
Thank you again. Thank you
Great
again.
presentation.
Everybody. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Catherine. Bye, Nancy. Bye, Susan.
Good night, everybody. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.